Welcome to my new terror story. Sit, relax, and enjoy my new video, and keep checking for new videos daily. The pit stop. The relentless hum of tires against asphalt was the only sound filling the night. Mark had been driving for hours, the black ribbon of the highway stretching endlessly ahead. His coffee sat cold in the cup holder, the caffeine having long since abandoned him. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:13 a.m. His wife, Emma, was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her head tilted awkwardly against the window. In the back, their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, lay sprawled out across the seat, clutching her stuffed bunny. They were on their way to visit Emma's family in Montana, a road trip they had planned for months. A flicker of light in the distance caught Mark's attention. A glowing neon sign materialized on the horizon like a mirage, breaking the monotony of the dark highway. Gas, food, open 24 hours, the sign promised in flickering red and green letters. Finally, Mark muttered. The gas tank was running low, and his bladder was protesting against the gallons of coffee he had consumed. He turned on his blinker and veered off the highway onto the dirt road leading to the pit stop. As they approached, the place looked both inviting and unsettling. The gas station was small, with peeling paint and an old-fashioned pump. Beside it stood a diner, its windows glowing warmly despite the desolation around it. A lone truck was parked in front of the diner, its cab empty. Mark pulled up to the pump and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Emma," he said softly, shaking her shoulder. "We're stopping for gas." She stirred, blinking groggily. "Where are we?" "Some pit stop," he replied. "Figured I'd fill up and use the restroom. You and Lily stay here." Emma nodded and stretched. "Be quick. This place gives me the creeps." Mark stepped out of the car, the cool night air prickling his skin. The station's pump was an ancient relic, the kind where you had to flip a lever to start the flow. He began filling the tank, his eyes drifting to the diner. Something about it was off. The fluorescent light inside flickered sporadically, and the booths were empty except for a lone figure sitting at the counter. The man was hunched over a plate of food, his movements slow and deliberate. Mark shrugged off the unease. It was late, of course, the place would be nearly deserted. The gas pump clunked, signaling a full tank. He replaced the nozzle and headed toward the diner's restroom. As he pushed open the door, a small bell chimed, announcing his entrance. The man at the counter didn't look up. The smell inside was strange, not the greasy aroma of fried food but something metallic, like rust. Mark wrinkled his nose and made a beeline for the restroom. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed loudly. The mirror was cracked, and the sink dripped steadily. As he washed his hands, a peculiar feeling crept over him, like he was being watched. He glanced up, his reflection distorted in the cracked glass. Behind him, the restroom door was open. He was sure he had closed it. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the tiny space. No answer. Mark shook his head and chalked it up to his imagination. He dried his hands and stepped back into the diner. The man at the counter was gone. The plate of food remained, untouched and pristine, as if it had just been served. Mark felt the hairs on his neck rise. He hurried out, pushing the diner door open with more force than necessary. Back at the car, Emma was wide awake, her expression tense. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, sliding into the driver's seat. "Lily said she saw someone outside," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the rearview mirror. Mark turned to look at their daughter. Lily's eyes were wide, her bunny clutched tightly. "A man," she said softly. "He was by the trees." Mark scanned the area. The darkness beyond the dim lights of the gas station was impenetrable. "There's no one out there, sweetheart," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Lily didn't respond. "Let's just get out of here," Emma urged. Mark nodded and started the engine. The headlights cut through the night as they pulled back onto the highway. The neon sign of the pit stop receded into the distance, but the unease lingered. For the next hour, silence filled the car. Lily had fallen asleep again, and Emma stared out the window, her fingers drumming against her knee. Mark glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought he saw headlights far behind them, but when he looked again, the road was empty. Then the radio crackled. Static filled the car, loud and jarring. Mark frowned and reached for the dial, but the static gave way to a low, garbled voice. "You shouldn't have stopped," it said. Emma gasped. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. "What the hell was that?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. I don't know," Mark stammered. The radio went silent. For a moment, they sat in stunned silence, the only sound their ragged breathing. Then Lily screamed. Mark and Emma whipped around. Lily was pointing out the back window, her face pale with terror. "There's someone out there," she cried. Mark turned to look. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man from the diner. He stood motionless in the middle of the road, his face obscured by the night. "Drive, Mark!" Emma shouted. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward. The figure disappeared into the night behind them, but the dread didn't fade. Miles passed, but the tension in the car was palpable. "I don't understand," Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did he get here? We're hours away from that diner." Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. The road stretched on, unchanging and oppressive. The headlights illuminated only an endless expanse of asphalt. And then, the car began to sputter. "No," Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The engine stuttered and died, the car coasting to a stop. Mark pounded the steering wheel in frustration. "I just filled the tank." Emma's breath hitched. "Mark, look." He followed her gaze. Up ahead, illuminated by the moonlight, was the same gas station. The same diner. "No," Mark whispered. "That's impossible." The neon sign flickered, its promise of gas, food, open 24 hours, mocking them. Mark glanced at Emma. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with fear. "We're not going back there," she said firmly. "We don't have a choice," Mark replied, his voice hollow. Reluctantly, he stepped out of the car. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. As he approached the gas station, the door to the diner creaked open. The man was standing there, his face still obscured. "Why are you doing this?" Mark shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The man didn't answer. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding. Then the lights of the gas station flickered and went out. The darkness was absolute. Mark fumbled for his phone, the weak beam of its flashlight barely cutting through the void. "Mark?" Emma's voice called out, trembling. "I'm here," he shouted back, his pulse racing. A hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, the flashlight illuminating the man's face. It wasn't a face at all. The thing staring back at him was featureless, its surface smooth like polished stone. Mark screamed. The next thing he knew, he was back in the car, Emma shaking him violently. "Mark! Wake up!" He blinked, disoriented. The car was moving, the highway stretching ahead of them once more. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You were screaming," Emma said, her eyes filled with tears. "I thought." Her voice trailed off as she glanced in the rearview mirror. Mark turned to look. The man was sitting in the back seat, Lily's stuffed bunny in his hands. And he was smiling. The next morning, a state trooper found the car abandoned on the side of the highway. The gas tank was full. There was no sign of the family. But on the dashboard, scratched into the plastic, were the words, "You shouldn't have stopped."